Welcome back to the Band Guide. I'm your band guy, Colin, and we need to talk about phase cancellation. Phase cancellation can be a huge problem in your mixes, but it likely isn't. You probably need to stop worrying about phase cancellation because there's only a handful of situations where phase cancellation can occur, but you can actually introduce it and make it a problem in your mixes if you don't really understand it and what might be causing it. So what I want to do in this video is explain what exactly phase cancel is, show it to you so you can visually see it and understand it conceptually. And then I want to show you some examples of it so you can hear it happening and understand what you might be listening for. And then finally, I want to give you a couple of plugins that you need to be avoiding or at least using really, really carefully if you don't want to create phasing issues in your music. Again, phase cancellation, phasing, whatever you want to call it, can be a huge problem. But if you understand it and know when to look for it and when it's likely not a problem, then you don't have to stress about it at all. And that's what I want to give you in this video. So let's go ahead and jump in and take a look at what exactly phasing is. All right, so the best way to understand phase cancellation is to look at waveforms. Waveforms are what all sound is made up of, whether it's a recorded sound or MIDI or a GarageBand drummer track or a Logic drummer track or Superior drummer. Any of those sources are creating waveforms, whether or not we see them. So here we're looking at an audio file. This is just a snare drum loop, and this is a waveform. If we listen to it, it sounds like this. Nothing to write home about, just a snare sample. And if we zoom in really close, we can see what we need to understand phase and what it means to be in phase and out of phase, aka phase cancellation. So here we see the waveform super clearly, and a waveform is made up of positive cycles or positive half cycles and negative half cycles. So we see it going up, positive, and down, negative. And this here is what's called one cycle of audio. Doesn't really matter too much, but just so you know. So a positive half cycle and negative half cycle. Now, if you have one source, there's no way for you to have any sort of phase cancellation. So if you just record something with one microphone, there's no way for you to have any sort of phase cancellation. Phase cancellation comes in when you introduce a second recording of that same exact source. So a really extreme example here is I've taken that same exact snare sound and I've flipped the phase or inverted the phase. And now you can see that when this waveform is going up, this waveform down here is going down. If I listen to this in solo, it sounds exactly the same compared to no audible difference. But when I put them together, you get this. It completely cancels it out, right? Now, this is a really, really extreme example, but this is fundamentally what phase cancellation is. It is when one sound has one waveform going up and another waveform going down at the exact same moment. And it has to be an identical sound for there to be phase cancellation. So where you often see this in the real world is anytime you're recording something with more than one microphone. Again, if you record with just one microphone, you can't have phase cancellation. But if you have two microphones, then you could have phase cancellation because they might be hearing the same source at slightly different times and hear it slightly differently. Now, it's not going to cancel this extremely because it's going to be hearing it slightly differently because it's in a slightly different position. But because it is one source being picked up by two microphones, it's going to have a little bit of phase cancellation or could have a little bit of phase cancellation, which is why it's really important that you get that position of those microphones really locked in the right place where they're equal distance from the source you're trying to record. That will typically give you in phase recordings. Now, let's look at an example of how that might actually look in a real life scenario. Here we have a drum recording, and this here is just the overhead microphone. So when you record drums, you typically are using several microphones. You might have direct microphones on the kick drum and the snare and the toms. And you'll also typically have overheads over the drum kit, getting kind of the holistic drum sound and also the stereo spread of the cymbals, all that good stuff. Now, a key place that people are paying attention to, pro mix engineers or recording engineers are paying attention to when they are setting up those microphones, is that the snare is in phase relative to those microphones. So they want to make sure that when you hit that snare, it's not actually canceling out some of the frequencies of that snare microphone. So they'll check those microphones relative to each other and relative to the snare. Here, we're just going to look at them relative to each other. So here we have the left microphone on the top, the right microphone on the bottom. Any stereo file, you typically have left on the top, right on the bottom. So this is our left side, this is our right side. And if we listen to this here, sounds good. Nothing to write home about again, it's just a drum recording, but it sounds good. Snare sounds good, it sounds full, sounds punchy. Now, what we can see here is that we have two audio files, but they are more or less in phase. It's okay if they're not 1000% in phase. It's recording music. We don't need to be super, super technical here, but they are more or less in phase. This one is generally going up, while this one is generally going up. This one is generally going down, while this one is generally going down. It's okay. It's actually very natural to have a little bit of variation between them. So this is a good in-phase overhead recording. Now, what I've done is I've taken one and flipped the phase of the left ear. Listen to this. Again, this is a more real-world example of phase cancellation. I still hear everything. I still hear that snare drum. Still, it actually sounds maybe wider. If we go back to the original, this one almost feels even bigger, even wider. But that snare is losing a little bit of its body and punch. And that's the key here. That's phase cancellation. That's very real world phase cancellation. So we can really hear this if we take our mix and collapse it into mono. So now everything is just up the center. So all I've done here is this is just a direction mixer in Logic. You have this in some tool like this in anything that you're mixing in. You can collapse this down to 0, which means that it is all up the center. And now pay attention to the difference in the sound of the snare. This is in phase. This is out of phase. Notice that there's more body to the snare and a little more punch. Check it out again. Thinner sounding snare, fuller sounding snare. Thinner, fuller. Right? So that is how you spot it. If it's sounding thinner, then it's likely out of phase. You can also look at the waveforms for a visual cue. Sometimes it can be hard to tell. So typically what you just want to listen for it and see if it sounds fuller when it's in phase or when it's out of phase. Any DAW has a plugin that allows you to flip phase. So this is just the gain plugin. You have this in Logic and GarageBand. There's some version of a phase invert in any DAW. And all I've done to correct this now in our out of phase one is invert the phase on the left side. So now when I turn this off, out of phase, thin, in phase, full and punchy, right? So this is the way you test it. If you think it might be out of phase, you just invert the phase of one, and if it sounds fuller when it's inverted, then it likely is more in phase, right? The other way that you can check it is with a correlation meter. Now, there's one built into Logic. There's a lot of free ones out there you can get. I don't encourage you to just run for this and always be checking it because this is rarely an issue. This is not an issue if you're working with mono sources or anything like that, but it can be an issue if you're recording multiple sources. I'm going to show you an issue in a minute of where you can actually introduce plugins in your mix that could also be creating issues. So stick around for that. But let's look at how we can see phase correlation on this meter. So with this meter, 0 means that is the least passable amount of phase in phase. 1 is perfectly in phase and -1 is like really out of phase. So anything below 0 is bad. So right now with our utility plugin here where I've inverted the phase on the left here off, we see that this is really out of phase, right? And when I flip this on, it flips to being in phase. It doesn't have to be perfectly in phase. Again, it can be natural to have a little bit of phasing, especially with something like a drum kit that has so many moving pieces at once, but we need it in that positive side. So if I turn this off, and it's on, we can see that it's in that positive side. So that's another way that you can check it is with some sort of correlation meter. Okay, and let's talk about how you might accidentally put your song out of phase, create phase cancellation in your song. The number one way that I see people do this is with any sort of stereo spreading plugin. These are really tempting because we think I want a big wide sound and this mix isn't sounding big and wide. So you start throwing stereo spreading plugins on individual sources, on their master track, trying to create a bigger, wider sound. Don't do that. This is not the way the pros operate. And we'll talk about what the pros do here in a minute. The way that you should be thinking about those is subtle, subtle, subtle if you use them at all. 9 times out of 10, you don't need to use them. 99 times out of 100, you don't need to use them. But if you are insisting on using them, they need to be subtle. Let me show you what a stereo spreading plugin is doing. So here we have just the direction mixer in Logic. This has this spread function here, and it will default to 1, which means that is just your normal amount of spread. As I pull this spread wider here, our mix gets wider, right? But what it's actually doing to do that is it's phase canceling the center of the mix. So anything that's in the middle is just getting canceled out. It sounds kind of terrible, right? And if we look at that on a correlation meter, we see it. We're we're way out of phase. If I turn this off, we're really well in phase. And notice this mix is big and wide in and of itself. There is no spreader or anything on this mix. This is just how it naturally sounds if you do all the right mixing components to get a big, wide sounding mix. So you don't need a stereo spreader. And it's the number one way that I see people putting their mix into an out of phase situation where it's starting to lose something and actually sound worse. Let's look at another one that people might use really commonly. This is the stereo spread. Again, this is Logic, GarageBand, anything like that. But there's usually some version of this in any DAW. When you first put that on, you might almost think, oh, that sounds better because it sounds wider, right? It sounds bigger. But look at our correlation meter, right? Compared to, right? So that's phase cancellation. So if you have to use a stereo spreader, if you're just dead set on it, you need to be really, really, really subtle with it. Typically, I don't do anything in the low range. So like down in my sub information, I'll cut that out completely and do none. And then I might set it up kind of into the mid-range and up and have it spread just a little bit up at the top. So it might be something like this. We're still relatively in phase. Kick this on. It's still relatively in phase, right? So you can use these, but you have to be super, super careful. That's the number one way that I see people getting out of phase. Now, I said at the beginning of this video that you likely don't need to worry about phase cancellation. As long as you're not using stereo spreaders in your mix, you're likely not introducing phase cancellation into your mix. This is the number one way I see people mess up and introduce phase cancellation, but most likely you're not recording a bunch of sources with a bunch of different microphones. And in addition to that, if you are recording things with a bunch of different microphones, maybe you don't need to be, unless you're working on a really stripped back song or a song where you really need to have a stereo piano part. And I'm not talking about a MIDI sampled piano part where you've recorded and are using a software instrument. Those are all going to be perfectly in phase. Any sort of Logic or GarageBand drummer, Superior drummer, any sort of virtual instrument is going to be perfectly in phase. It's when you're recording in the real world two microphones and they are hearing the same thing and they're hearing them at slightly different times in a way that is causing phase cancellation, where one cycle's going up or half cycle's going up while the other one is going down. That is when you're creating phase cancellation. Otherwise, you don't need to worry about it, right? What you do need to worry about is mixing your song properly, getting a great recording, starting with just typically one mic on each individual source, maybe two, but making sure that they're in phase, and you now know how to check that, invert it if you need to, and then mixing, and you don't need to worry about stereo spreaders and mixing if you want to get a big wide mix. The secret is to just use a handful of tools in a very intentional way, and I want to give you something to help with that. I've put together a completely free 6-step checklist to create a pro mix inside GarageBand, and if you can do it inside GarageBand, you can do it anywhere. In fact, the song that we're listening to here was mixed inside GarageBand following the 6-step checklist. It's completely free from the link in the description below, and it's really going to help you out. It walks through the 6 steps and the tools that all the pros use for every mix that they've ever done and how you can do them inside your DAW as well. There's a link in the description below where you can pick it up, so be sure to grab it. And before we go, I want to hear from you. Do you think you've ever actually had phase cancellation in any of your songs? If so, what do you think caused it? Let me know in the comments below. If this video was helpful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next week with another video.